Hi, welcome to another episode. It's come to my attention that this lounge season is coming to an end soon, and I still have 2 recordings that I really desperately need to use before next season gets here, including this one. Unfortunately for you, the viewer, this is going to be perhaps the worst gameplay of mine that I've ever uploaded. The reason why I'm using Dry Bowser in this recording is because this took place during the Halloween tourney finals from last year, which had a predefined track list of vaguely dark-themed tracks. Likewise, Funky Kong and most other characters also weren't allowed, but I'll get to the character selection in just a minute. I wanted to upload this room primarily because it's this kind of peculiar, sort of rare strain of footage that I like, but also because the top half of this room skill-wise was extremely good, and when having this many consistently top 10 ranked players in 1LU, the associated mercilessness and heavily mistake-penalizing nature of a tourney finals suits this topic more than an average event. With that in mind, this will undoubtedly be the most severe case of do as I say, not as I do witnessed in any of my videos thus far, but I do think this will consist of worthwhile advice. The coping mechanisms I employ for my own inability to play the game properly have resulted in a decent quality of thought in the past, so perhaps I can shed light on something here as well. Before anything else, I wanted to first consider the format for this tournament, seeing as it will be a microcosm of the topic at large and is also a sort of precursor for what I'll be mentioning initially before I get into marginal advantage within presumably conventional events. To start off with, this isn't the first time that this tournament format has been done in Lounge. Our tourney with a very similar rule set was hosted in 2023 as well, but as a 2v2 as opposed to FFA this time. The general idea was the same in that there were track list and character restrictions so as to be vaguely Halloween themed. Of course, one of the criticisms of this iteration of the tournament format that you're watching is that the intended effect of getting into the season spirit is not only difficult enough on its own, when people would rather be driving with Funky Kong's maneuverability subtleties and playing on tracks that don't require them to turn their TV brightness up, but also that the heightened level of competitiveness of a tournament compared to something like a themed squad queue also prevents the gimmick from being taken at face value as much as the organizers would like. Despite these misgivings, I observed something noteworthy within this barely utilized format. A development I can trace across time from 2024's Halloween tourney to 2023's is that I got to witness a unique kind of sub-meta forming and then evolving in real time throughout my time playing both of them. In 2023's tourney, Zach and I got knocked out before finals, but I still did watch the finals. I also, of course, have the experience of having played in those early rounds. That year, the ubiquitous meta of character selection was Dry Bowser. The rationale was the same as the one that goes into kart TTs, slower speed but higher mini-turbo. Non-Dry Bowser was of course allowed. There were a few other characters as well, but over the course of the tourney, everyone using them switched over to Dry Bowser, and as I said, the finals were played with Dry Bowser just about across the board. Then came this year's tourney, and so armed with the recollection as to what the universal character choice would supposedly be, I decided to stick with Dry Bowser. Here's where things took a turn for the worse. You see, Heavy Me was allowed by the rule set, the presumption being that someone could make a Halloween-themed me. Jesse was one of the only people to actually do that this time around. In practice, though, Heavy Me finding itself as the go-to meta character simply didn't come to pass that year, despite its superiority to Dry Bowser speed-wise. My hypothetical genealogy of the 2023 tourney is that, since the character restriction format had never been played before, those who didn't have any idea as to what character to use simply latched onto the Dry Bowser players who seemed to know what they were doing, which in turn continued to propagate itself until it reached a ubiquitous status. This same effect could have, in a deterministic sense, just as easily gone a different way if those who didn't put any stock into considering what character was optimal beforehand had just so happened to witness good players using Heavy Me's in their early rounds in 2023. But despite the fact that I was aware of that benefit beforehand, I decided nevertheless that this time around I wanted to blend in with what I assumed would be the common character choice. Over the course of that decision being proven a terrible idea, I simultaneously got to witness a very interesting phenomenon. In the rounds prior to the footage you're watching, I became a first-hand observer to what I can essentially describe as an archetype on a tangible and observable scale to the concept of meta development itself, as more and more people went to the me channel after each round to make a heavy me and thereby switched off of dry Bowser. The character demographics were as I expected initially, but from the semi-finals to the finals in particular, the proportion of heavy me's went from a noteworthy faction to a critical mass. Apart from me, James05 was the only other dry Bowser in the room. You may be wondering why I'm detailing this occurrence to the extent I am, the overarching sentiment of mine being that this footage is 40 fucking minutes long, which means I certainly don't need to try to be economical with how I divide up the topics, but this is a pertinent subject because it is a perfect metaphor for the subject matter. First of all, I think it's fascinating as a sociological concept to see this character meta, something that will probably never be relevant again, develop from just a blank slate, a slice of MKW's character roster chosen completely arbitrarily for this dumb little gimmick tourney format, then into a nascent meta, and then even further beyond that into a state of what can now be considered optimized, with all of this taking place on such a small scale that it can be zeroed in on and looked at as a model for meta development. Secondly, and here's where we will finally enter the scope of why I personally care about this, the development of character choices across the two Halloween tourneys is representative of how I personally am stuck in the past, with regards to the broader meta and my proportional skill at the game. I'm capable of recognizing what is occurring around me, placing the trends that I witness into categories and reconciling them with all my other observations, but I then fall into a now recognizable personal cycle of underestimating the extent to which any meta shift is occurring, and then, when I am forced to confront it, like with the change in the mainstream competitive track picking approach over the course of the past few years, I'm still affected by it. Despite not being necessarily blindsided, it's just that I'm so stagnant and inert in my old gen ways, such that I never give these precipitating trends the credence that I should. Likewise, it's also a parable for why I did so terribly in the round you're watching. Not only had I failed to keep up with contemporary trends like character choice, which does of course impact my actual in-race performance, but which I'm still going to consider a meta aspect for the sake of categorization, but also failed in my strictly in-race performance, which, as a definition, is the extent to which the inputs that I make on my controller do or do not contribute to me scoring points. It shouldn't be very difficult to tell, needless to say, but I was fucking sucking this entire round and getting hit, missing boxes, driving awfully, completely misusing dodges, and so on. In the preceding rounds, my gameplay was fine, which is easy to say in less skilled rooms, of course, but I have a lot to get at in the realm of why. Oftentimes when I play the game nowadays, I'm doing so on a non-warmed-up basis. But this is quite the opposite. I had multiple hours of very fulfilling online gameplay just prior to this as I qualified for the finals. No, the explanation I'm going to offer for this is of a completely different domain, and it's one which will allow me to delve into a subject that would otherwise be reserved exclusively for only the most unreserved tryhards to touch the game. Before I can get into it, though, I think it'll be much more broadly comprehensive if I first reflect on how I was primed into this idea in the first place. I don't have a slick moniker for it like I have for some of the concepts I've labeled in previous videos, but the general idea, at least for this sliver of the video's broader topic that I'm focusing in on at the moment, I'll refer to as physical tryharding. It describes what I'd consider a very neglected principle, optimizing your body itself to play the game more effectively. It seems like a silly idea initially, an assessment that I would have likely agreed with in the past since I've historically been skeptical as to how much of an impact it can supposedly make. One instance being when I was watching Leop stream a Mogi and he said that he was going to go splash cold water on his face so that he could concentrate better, which I didn't really take seriously and attributed more to his unapologetic personality than anything else. I'm sure my past self wasn't alone in this, seeing as expressing something in this vein of thought will typically get you laughed at for being a nerd, but I did still make one big internal concession. I noticed quite a while back that whether or not I was in the right mood just as I began to play a given lounge event would have an overwhelming likelihood of determining whether or not I would score. Over the course of probably 6 to 8 full months, I became hopelessly superstitious about this, giving into the idea that I would only have a chance of performing well when I had what I didn't refer to as a quote-unquote bad feeling going into the event. But that wording probably seems completely misleading, considering that even the faintest inkling that something is off about me physiologically as I loaded up the first race would throw me off. This involuntary fixation eventually faded away, but during the period that I obsessed over it, it had an uncoincidentally high rate of success in predicting if I would win or lose a given Mogi. Since that kind of irrational thought doesn't seem to affect me much anymore, I suppose it would probably objectively be chalked up to coincidence, but it did get me thinking about an approach to gameplay optimization from a different community that I have found very interesting in the past. I forget if I've mentioned Geometry Dash in a previous video, but this anecdote is from an avenue of the community that will likely be new even to those who are familiar with GD. There's a relatively small and highly competitive server within the playing community called the Challenge List. In Geometry Dash, levels are only considered challenges if they're less than 30 seconds long, as opposed to normal levels which are much longer than that. Now, if you've watched the previous entries in this series, you'll be familiar with my frequent references to deterministic feedback loops, which I've described as Evo Psych in the past, or, in other words, how the underlying circumstances of something can predispose it to develop in a specific trajectory that functionally pertains to addressing those pre-existing circumstances in themselves. In this instance, levels in GD that are less than 30 seconds long require a much more focused and hyper-optimized approach than levels that are, say, 2 minutes long, because they are far easier to memorize and develop muscle memory for as a result of the shortened length. However, the trade-off for the decreased length is that the difficulty of challenges is naturally much more compressed, and may require you to click at a very high speed in an extremely unforgiving pattern, as opposed to conventional levels which fit the framework of the conventional endurance challenge that you're used to if you've played demon levels in GD. As a result of the unique conditions that challenge players find themselves in, the challenge community focuses exponentially more so on optimizing their gameplay itself than other GD players do. Of course, by attempting to find ways to gain skill at a more efficient rate than if they were not actively attempting to. But that's something that gamers will do everywhere. Challenge players focus on optimizing the meta conditions of their gameplay, including techniques pertaining to building muscle memory more stringently, for instance, like I just mentioned. Or, much more commonly, optimizing their computer's software and hardware. Enter Sizzy, who is one of the most revered mod devs in GD and who created a physics fix mod that just about every serious player uses. But back in 2022, he was just an average challenge list tryhard with an above-average knowledge of hardware who was trying to improve by any means. Despite the fact that GD has never been my main game, I was still maintaining a more peripheral awareness of the community at the time than I am now, which is how I became aware of Sizzy's gameplay optimization guide one day. I'll put it in the description if you'd like to see it. It's a list of over 40 tricks that people could use to instantly improve their gameplay. The list itself was a very sporadic list of entries that spanned the entire scope of possible fields of optimization. There was hardly any common denominator to the list. It just included about any action apart from, well, simply physically clicking your mouse to the level's pattern better that could streamline your experience playing the game so as to facilitate better gameplay. What was fascinating to me about the guide was just how high level some of the entries were. Sizzy took a specifically mold-breaking approach to crafting his list by mentioning topics that would have otherwise never been taken seriously by the larger community. General themes amongst the topics on the list range from everything to do with software and hardware, but also, finally, circling back to something relevant to MKW, physical optimization. One of the relatively higher-up suggestions on the list is to make sure that you're physically healthy, and that your room has sufficient air quality. Now, of course, it's not exactly as if the comparative importance of doing that versus any other thing was established with the scientific method, but looking back, I really appreciate the mere mention of things like that, because it reestablished in my mind the notion that physical optimization is worth looking into. However, for the Purposes of this video and for MKW, I don't really have any new ideas that have to do with physical optimization to bring to the table. Everyone already leans forward in their chair when they're tryharding. After all, that's probably the most impactful of all the theoretically possible optimization-related methods. By contrast, I'll instead discuss everything that went wrong for me here with this line of thought in mind. In honor of going as high level as possible, I'll now do just that. My problem with tourneys has always been that they take place during the daytime. I play the game on a TV in a room with windows that face the sunlight in the time of year that this took place in, meaning that when the sun shines in, it's much harder to see. I tried turning up my TV brightness, but it was at a really inopportune time of day. All of this would have already made my experience inherently more difficult from the get-go in any normal event, but in this instance it gets worse. Remember how I said there are non-replicable conditions that only affect this format? Because the list of available tracks for this tourney was Halloween themed to go with the tourney theme, like I mentioned, meaning they would have all already been difficult enough to see on a TV as is. Compound that with the sun shining right on my screen, and you end up with a pretty hilarious mental image of me straining my eyes the entire time, struggling to navigate all these super dark tracks. But if that were the only external obstacle I was facing, this would hardly be worth mentioning. I was actually being hindered in multiple more ways. Let's reconcile two simple concepts, one of them MKW related and one of them a physical principle. As you play MKW uninterrupted for a long time while tryharding, you'll start sweating because you're concentrating. Additionally, if the sun is shining in your room during the day, it'll start to get warm. My room had already been hot to begin with, but as time went on, I didn't notice that I was pretty much starting to overheat. By the time we were halfway through GP1 and finals, I was getting up to get water every race because I had a heat-induced headache that severely hindered my ability to concentrate. But okay, all of this is just a manifestation of the "here's some incredibly boring information about my life" meme so far. I'm not trying to pin my failure this round on some sense of elusive, unlucky IRL RNG, because there are multiple things I could have done to mitigate feeling like shit. With that in mind, here is one principle that I developed for myself as a result of this experience, as well as some previous long sessions, that I think can be useful to others playing in long, uninterrupted tourneys, or maybe even just chaining lounge events. And that is, in between rounds, get up from your chair and walk away from your setup for several minutes. I specifically mean something longer than a bathroom break or getting up to grab a drink for a second. If you imagine yourself as having some kind of gamified exhaustion meter, then the best way to replenish it, in my opinion, is honestly to step outside between rounds. CT tourneys haven't been 4 rounds in years at this point, but when they were, I would always end up feeling debilitatively hungry in the finals because I hadn't eaten, meaning I'd practically always perform worst in the finals. People know to eat in between rounds, of course, but always make sure to keep track of how long it's been since your last meal so that you can eat something before you get hungry. If you get hungry going into GP3 of a round you need to really focus for, then you can easily end up losing your edge when it matters. But I mean, who am I, your nutrition coach? I'm just lecturing on rudimentary life advice at this point. The point is that the two things I mentioned, getting up from your setup between rounds and not letting yourself get hungry, is the best way to maximize the number of optimal conditions that you'll be in while playing. It'll ensure that you'll be warmed up while also not being exhausted or burned out, and it'll also help you in a homeostatic sense since even if the conditions in your room aren't ideal, you'll be refreshed by the time you come back. Taking care to make sure you are not hungry at any point during the tourney is of course self-evident, but it can even help to contribute how warmed up you are. If you're hungry during the semifinals, struggle to concentrate, and barely end up qualifying for finals, you'll have warmed up to a lower standard of gameplay than you're going to end up needing in the finals. I was initially going to conclude this section on that note, but I happened to recall another element to this that I had forgotten about. You may consider the fact that I had forgotten about it interesting, considering that I imagine most people would instinctively associate the notion of optimal gaming physiology with it. It's also sort of a remnant meme from the casual side of the community, that being hydration. Although, to be honest, I have nothing to say as to how much this may matter because I don't have any personal experience with dehydration. I always make sure to bring water wherever I go. I keep a cup of water near me between races. It's not the kind of thing that I've ever had to remind myself of. However, there are people out there who evidently not only think of such a thing actively, but also treat being hydrated as a very grave matter. I actually have some personal experience in this field, so here's a bit of a funny story. It takes place almost a full decade ago, from back in the summer of 2015 when I was 13 and trying to reach the next stage of my Minecraft PvP career. I'd played on practice servers for a while at that point, but I wanted to get into a game mode called Hardcore Factions. Hardcore Factions essentially requires very long periods of active, focused playtime. Some events can be hours long and require you to listen carefully to comms and take orders on a team while simultaneously trying to play for yourself by ensuring you don't die. Because if you do, you get automatically banned from the server for a few hours and your faction loses power and all the gear that you died with. You don't need to be entirely aware of how the game plays on a micro level, but the skill set you need for high-level gameplay in Hardcore Factions has to do with very large-scale team coordination that requires good performance under pressure. The faction I was trying to get into was comparatively out of the picture in terms of major events like that, though it was more so geared towards newer players like myself at the time who were trying to get into the game. You may be aware of how overwhelmingly self-important the team communication coordinators and leaders in some other lifestyle games like World of Warcraft take themselves, but strictly speaking, that wasn't really a concept that was witnessed as often in Minecraft. Team communications themselves for major events oftentimes sounded like a dozen Ornans vying for dominance, but it was all couched within a sort of work hard, play hard context, not like how you would imagine some neck-bearded guildmaster in an MMO. The team leader for this particular clan, though, may as well have been trying to take lessons directly from those kinds of people, because for some reason he was taking my new member interview extremely seriously, even more so than a job interview. Despite the fact I recall him being quite a personable guy, so I guess he was just forcing it. At the beginning of the interview, he told me something that caught me off guard, which was that none of the questions he was going to ask me would be jokes and that I should mute my mic if I felt the need to laugh. But all the questions were just your standard, what's your availability and what kind of experience do you have playing the game, and I did just fine. The interesting part comes at the end of the interview, when he tells me he has just one more question to ask, and that it would be the most important thing that he could impart on me. He asked me whether or not I would commit to staying hydrated during long play sessions, and told me that it was extremely important because one of the most critical factors in determining if a person is capable of operating at their highest reasoning and decision-making capacity is if they had made sure to drink water at regular intervals. I didn't find the question funny at all, I just thought it was strange because it was the kind of thing I'd never thought of and certainly didn't expect to be asked about. I was going to answer candidly, but just then, my mom came in and started talking to me, so I had to mute. I quickly told the guy interviewing me that I had to mute, and it was so awkward knowing that he assumed I had somehow considered his question such an insult that I had to mute my mic to laugh, despite the fact I didn't actually do that at all. I guess mid-2010s Minecraft players weren't the ideal audience for that kind of thing, because I don't know why he would have told me to take the question seriously if other people hadn't written it off in the past. I never did end up taking his advice because, like I said, I've always drank enough water, but I think it's an amusing story. I have no clue where my clan leader's particularity with hydration came from, but it does go to show that considerations like this in the realm of super tryhard competitive gaming have been around since long before us. I will get back to MKW once again now. But all of this over-analysis necessitates a reconsideration of the point of deliberating on this in the first place. I'm sure you can think of many instances when you've been playing a Mogi under suboptimal conditions and still managed to perform perfectly fine. I'm also sure that people play the game like this all the time. Of the hundreds of players across the span of events that take place in Lounge every day, I'm sure there are dozens of players who do so while hungry or thirsty or have a headache. The question is, why does it matter that I was in bad physical condition at the time of the recording that's currently on the screen? It's not as if I was dropping wheelies or missing item sets just because I was in a hot room IRL. My response to this once again lies in why I chose tourney finals footage for this subject. I have witnessed throughout my MKW career an atmosphere inherent to tournaments that is really only otherwise found in something like a playoff finals match. I'm partially referring to how these rooms feel to play, but only insofar as how the oppressive and tense try-hard climate of these rooms contributes to an in-game experience that doesn't exist in ordinary events. Playing at your best in a tournament room is much more comparatively important, not just because of how end-of-round eliminations work, but also because of how that system reinforces the maximalist nature of the second-by-second interactions you experience in a tourney room. The way tourneys play out is truly fascinating because it is one of the most try-hard experiences it's possible to go through in MKW, and proves what potential exists in terms of sheer competitiveness when the game is being taken at its most serious. This is another reason why I'm presenting this set of topics alongside this footage, because the base level of gameplay seen in a tournament best illustrates how and why advice like this can come into play. The key to understanding the difference maker in rooms that exist at such a high level of gameplay is, this is the part of the video where I coin a new phrase, marginal advantage. Physical optimization merely exists under the umbrella of marginal advantage. This is an idea that I've been mulling on for years, honestly, so I may as well start from the beginning. Around the turn of the decade, I feel like I say that a lot, I started to first consider how it was that top players were able to actually reliably win events. I recall being stuck in a rut of scoring 40 for multiple events in a row, which I guess could, if you wanted to give me a favorable interpretation, be attributed to proportionally better rooms back then, and first starting to really try to consolidate my nascent ideas about in-race seeding and positioning into something palpable. I failed in that task. The reason I know I did is because before I lost all my old footage, I watched some of my events and realized that I had far less game sense than I believed I did back then. The important takeaway from this, though, is that I realized something about race positioning and seeding. It's a two-sided coin. Up until this point, I had been, not sure how else to put this, superstitious about my scores. I didn't attribute them to luck per se, but rather to an underlying lack of ability to get into the correct scenarios each race, which I then further attributed to luck. The thing about race positioning is that it inherently is impossible to give advice on in the strictest definition. You can provide examples of plays you've made within races in which you used game sense to get into a better seed, but short of sitting in call with someone giving them advice while you watch their POV, you can't impart advice on how to play each scenario onto anyone else. And even then, you lose the kind of moment-by-moment decision-making that true top players can epitomize. My problem was that I assigned too much significance to the kind of race-winning seeds that you find yourself in based upon dumb luck or misplays. Let's take a theoretical race where you hold A in a mid spot with no overarching game plan, fall off, and then pull a star first try once you're in the bottom spot, which you chain into next set and then dodge with. The reason I was so stuck on the idea of something like this was because I was the person in that mid-pack who was getting passed by the dodgers, who I perceived as having played the race poorly. That theoretical star dodger did play terribly in one sense, but their, at face value, criticism-worthy gameplay was actually much closer to optimal than anyone would like to admit, seeing as it did end up scoring them points. I suppose you could use this as a criticism of what kind of gameplay ends up being functionally successful in MKW, but criticisms of this game itself never stick, and that's not the point anyways. The point is that there is an equal and opposite field within the sphere of MKW gameplay that exists diametric to that undeserved dodger. That field once again being marginal advantage. In truth, the example that I gave is hardly an example of whatever the opposite of how good players use marginal advantage is. That was still from a cynical perspective, and on the surface there's a lot to be cynical about. How about an instance like someone clipping off-road in 8th near a set, causing them to barely touch a box in 9th and thereby pull a 2.5% bill, which they then dodge in, winning them the race? Or how about someone missing an MT, thereby resulting in them being just slow enough to be shocked onto a ramp as opposed to being TS'd off? But wait a minute, because that right there actually has a discernible opposite. How about instead, you imagine a scenario in which someone drives just fast enough in first to reach the line before being blued. This is the other side of the coin. And it's this that represents the theory behind marginal advantage and why it matters. This is crucial to understand because of how deeply it's baked into MKW. Marginal advantage is the framework that you're operating in whenever you try to force outline the guy ahead of you, so that you can be in second and don't have to worry about pulling a TC, or so that you can be in first and don't have to worry about getting backed. Doing something or possessing something, i.e. a greater level of skill, to a marginally greater extent than your opponents is the basis of high-level MKW gameplay. I've had these thoughts stirring in my head for quite a while, so none of my commentary on this particular subject right here is anything I've synthesized recently, but I played something recently that got me to realize just how much there is to the opposite side of that suck balls and still win clause. There was a pack made for online TTs that uses a slightly outdated version of the CTGP tracklist. It went inactive a while ago, but one day people were gathering for a room, so I got to play it again for the first time in a few months. It was actually getting me pretty frustrated because I was sweating my dick off and could not compete at all. But in my defense, I was playing against even more grandmasters than there are in this tourney room, which is already good. I think it was like Thunder, Pepe, Abalash, and Ton, alongside some other TT mains. To put into perspective how much time I was losing on tech tracks, by the time lap 2 of Pipe Underworld was over, Pepe and Abalash's names were no longer on my screen because they were so far ahead. No battle glitch, mind you, but the point still stands. That level of driving is what is being played against each and every time online. That fact should be kept in mind, though, the fact that I have now transitioned back to discussing online, because I have another thought experiment in mind pertaining to the subtopic I was just on prior to right now. In the same way that failing to lead to winning, it is also certainly the case that playing effectively during a crucial juncture of a race can, through MKW's inherent capacity to drastically amplify the intensity of a circumstance that was arrived at marginally, result in a completely undeserved loss. I'm sure that sounds like word garble, but imagine a ramp that is prone to being TS'd on. Imagine that this ramp has a pretty average respawn and places you forwards while still losing time from having been TS'd. Perhaps on this track, the placement of the item sets, in tandem with how spread out the pack tends to be, frequently results in shocks TSing players on this aforementioned ramp. Here is the scenario for this mental exercise. Imagine that a master or grandmaster level player who, as a result of driving well consistently, has a 10% higher rate of getting TS'd on that ramp, whether it's getting shocked off the track or shocked on landing with no trick boost, than someone who's platinum or low sapphire, an average rank. Or to rephrase it, if a shot comes near the ramp, they have a 60% chance of not benefiting, whereas the theoretically average player has just a 50% chance of not benefiting. I'm making all of this up, by the way. This isn't meant to reflect anything in reality at all. Now extrapolate that ever so slightly unluckier condition to a few other hypothetical instances across the breadth of the pack. The question is, even if we arbitrarily apply this condition to this skilled player to say that they will be getting slightly unluckier per situation, is it still worth it for that very fast player to drive well? Would they be better off being average? The answer is, of course, no. It is still worth it to drive well and play well, because even under the assumption that this marginally worse situational luck exists, the total benefit incurred from playing marginally better than the other players throughout the entire race in every scenario, including crucial ones like tense outline situations, instances where good alt lines are necessary to maintain your spot in the midst of a clusterfuck pack with tons of items being used. These are the plays that Pepe and Abalash have the opportunity to make because their lines are marginally better than others. Their Funky Kongs still go 97 kmh when wheeling just like everyone else, and yet the way in which they maneuver their joysticks ever so slightly better than all the others gives them the disposition to enter scenarios that are vastly better than those that can't drive and don't know how to navigate around close packs with high rates of item usage. It's the perfect antidote to the archetype of the player who loses spots naturally over time like a fucking simulation of entropy. When it comes to top players, every turn and every action represents a personal realization of their own marginal skill disparity over others, which then manifests itself in race. Whether it's immediate or only comes to fruition right at the end of the race, marginal benefit exists universally in MKW. For the concluding topic of this video, now that the recording is practically over, I'll connect marginal advantage to the idea of tourney gameplay. Tangibly, that is, not just conceptually, as well as what I should have done better, although that will essentially be from a conceptual standpoint, but it does have to do with gameplay style. First of all, what's one recurring theme of the atrocious gameplay that you've borne witness to in this video, apart from the constant abject fails, that is? a failure to take heed of what kind of gameplay was necessary for the type of room I was in. My recognition of that shortcoming was something that I had a hard time coming to grips with when rewatching this footage, reason being that I simply spent so much time in either the back or in situations where I was at the mercy of someone else. Being in the back is obvious enough. It's not the kind of thing I need to really waste my breath on, especially on a track list composed of primarily running favored tracks. By contrast, that latter concern is much more interesting. A phenomenon that I have noticed in tournaments, particularly with regards to shock usage and particularly in later rounds, is how the plays made by people who know what they're doing and who are playing in accordance with the hyper-competitive atmosphere will gravitate far away from the middle. The middle of what exactly? The middle of the spectrum between aggressive and conservative gameplay. The number of plays that don't fall strictly within one of those two categories sharply decreases in late-stage tourney rounds. My brain-dead shock usage on Lost Fortress, for instance, was ostensibly done with this exact principle in mind. I wanted to use a shock that was completely ordinary so as to shock everyone out who used their dodges early under the assumption that the dodge users were expecting me to use an aggressive one. It didn't work, but that was the intention. But why does this polarization of play happen? The fact that I tried to play with this model in mind says nothing about how it came to be. It came to be completely holistically. It's just something that I happened to observe. The first reason this maybe has to do with what I already addressed at length, the context of the room, characteristic of any tourney. I have another more discernible explanation though, and it's as simple as taking a glance at how rewards are distributed for finals participants. In 2v2s, I believe the rewards scale mostly linearly, but in FFA, bottom spots are assigned into two-man echelons, meaning that I got the same reward as James05, who got 9th overall despite the fact that I got 10th. But forget that, irrespective of how exactly the rewards are assigned, the stated goal of the finals room, if you aren't realistically going to win that is, which most people will probably be aware of at around the halfway point, is to try to get in the money, so to speak, to the greatest extent possible. Once someone realizes that they're both not winning and not in the running for a particularly high spot, their most logical choice from an elo gain perspective is to start playing with much more severity. Whatever playstyle you would have had, multiply the intensity tenfold, whether that be trying to dodge, run, or whatever else, because if you do get punished for being over-aggressive, it's no skin off your nose since you aren't losing any elo, you just happen to fail in your entirely understandable attempt to gain more. My failure in this round, alongside all of the ones I listed in the first half of the video, was not adjusting to that no-holds-barred playstyle that I would have needed. And with that, I can conclude the commentary. I apologize if I allocated too much time to flippant matters or branched off into anything that wasn't intellectually stimulating. I really do want to keep including segments comparing other games to MKW, and I'm sure my thoughts on them will eventually make their way into their own videos. Next video will be on a topic that I've been waiting to do until I could really establish the series. It'll be about the sad fate of my favorite track. I'll hardly have any free time this month to make it, unfortunately, but I will try to get it done by around the end of the season. Until then, thank you sincerely for watching. Leave a comment for absolutely any reason you would like, and goodbye.